June the 14th, 1944, a village in Normandy called Lingèvres, still smoking. 3 Sherman tanks rolled through the rubble that afternoon. American-built. Same hulls that came off the same production lines in Michigan and Detroit that had turned out tens of thousands of them. 3 of the 4 tanks in that column looked like every other Sherman in France. The 4th did not. Barrel too long. Turret carrying a steel box bolted to its back that no American factory had ever put there. The breech of the main gun opened sideways, left to right, because no one had found another way to make it fit inside. The man commanding that strange machine was Sergeant Wilfred Harris, 33 years old, from Walsall in the English Midlands. He had been at Dunkirk in 1940. He had watched his regiment burn every tank it owned on the beach and sail home with nothing. 4 years later, he was back. This time, sitting in a Sherman the British government itself had tried to kill in a shed in Dorset 1 year before. In the next 40 minutes, that tank would kill or disable 5 German Panther tanks, the heaviest armour Hitler could still field in France in the summer of 1944. 5 Panthers, 5 shells. On paper, impossible. The story you have probably heard is 5 shots, 5 kills. That is close to the truth. It is not exactly the truth. The version the records tell is stranger, harder, and in the end more honest than the legend. And to understand what Harris did that afternoon, you have to leave Normandy entirely. You have to go 2 years back and 2,000 miles south to a burning tank in the Libyan desert and to a man the British Army had already declared finished. This is the story of how a weapon nobody in charge wanted killed 5 Panther tanks in one afternoon. If it hooks you, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who care about them. Libya, June, 1942. A place on the map called Gazala. Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge sat inside a British M3 Grant tank. Around him, the desert filled with dust and the smoke of burning diesel. Rommel's Panzers were moving through the haze. The Grant carried a 75mm gun, the same caliber that would one day arm the Sherman. Witheridge's crew fired. The rounds hit. The rounds bounced. He watched his shells strike the flanks of German tanks and fall away like stones off a wall. He heard the sound. A flat clang of steel meeting steel, and being refused. He would carry that sound with him for the rest of the war. Then something hit the Grant. Witheridge was blown out of the turret, burned, broken, alive. The army looked at what was left of him and made a decision. He was declared unfit for combat duty. They pulled him off the line and gave him a desk. On paper, the war was over for George Witheridge. He would sit somewhere quiet for the rest of it, out of the way, out of danger, out of the fight. The army had made a mistake. A man who has heard the sound of his own shells bouncing off enemy armour does not forget it. A man in a chair with time to think, and years of connections in the service, and a memory that will not let him rest, is more dangerous than the army realised. They meant to shelve him. Instead, they had just started him. January 1943. The British Army posted Witheridge across the Atlantic. 6 months in Kentucky, at a place called Fort Knox. His orders were simple. Advise the Americans on gunnery. Teach them what British tank crews had learned in the desert. He arrived expecting to teach. What happened instead was that the Americans taught him. Witheridge drove their Shermans. He watched the mechanics work on them. He saw a tank that started when the ignition turned, that did not break down in the mud, that could roll for hundreds of miles and still fight at the end. He came back to England a convert, not to the Sherman's gun. He already knew the 75 was obsolete. He had watched its rounds bounce off Rommel's tanks in the sand. He came back sold on the Sherman itself. The chassis, the hull, the steel platform that kept moving when British tanks did not. And with that came the idea, simple, strange, and in the eyes of every qualified engineer in Britain, impossible. Take the American tank. Take the one British anti-tank weapon that could actually kill a Panther, the 17-pounder, a 76mm gun that could punch through 140mm of steel at 1,000 yards. Put one inside the other. Everyone he explained the idea to told him the same thing. The gun does not fit. The turret is too small, the recoil is too long. The breech would strike the turret roof before it opened wide enough to load. The physics did not work. Engineer after engineer looked at the numbers and shook their heads. It could not be done. It should not be attempted. Witheridge did not particularly care what could not be done. He had heard the sound at Gazala. He knew what British tank crews would face when the invasion of France finally came. And he was not going to arrive on that beach with the same gun that had failed him in the desert. There was, as it turned out, one man in England who felt exactly the same way. June 1943, Lulworth, on the Dorset coast. The Royal Armoured Corps Gunnery School. Witheridge arrived at Lulworth to evaluate a tank the British government was pinning its hopes on. It was called the A-30 Challenger, Britain's official answer to the heavy German Panthers, its intended weapon for the coming invasion of France. He inspected it, he tested it, and he joined, as one account later put it, the chorus of complaints. The Challenger was overweight, unreliable, months, perhaps a year, from being ready. It would not make D-Day. Whatever it did on paper, it would not be there when British tank crews needed it most. But someone at Lulworth had been thinking exactly what Witheridge had been thinking. His name was Major George Brighty, Royal Tank Regiment. He had been at Lulworth since early in 1943. He had looked at the 17-pounder gun. He had looked at the Sherman turret. And he had done something that every qualified engineer in Britain had told him was physically impossible. He had put the gun inside the turret. There was a catch. Brighty had not solved the recoil problem. He had removed the recoil problem. He had simply bolted the 17-pounder to the mount. Rigid, no buffer, no cushion, no spring absorbing the blast. When the gun fired, the entire tank shook. The recoil punched through the mount, into the turret ring, into the hull, into the frame. 40 inches of violent backward force, with nothing to soak it up but the machine itself. It was brutal. It was crude. It was, in the eyes of any professional engineer, a Frankenstein. The first time Witheridge saw it fire, he did not climb inside. He stood outside the tank and watched the barrel jump, watched the whole hull shudder. He had it fired 3 times before he was willing to take his own place in the turret and try it. But when the shell left the barrel, it left at nearly 3,000 feet per second, and at 800 yards, it could go through a Panther's frontal armour like paper. Witheridge, the man who remembered Gazala, understood exactly what that was worth. 2 officers, 1 prototype, 1 tank in a shed in Dorset that was crude and shaking and possibly the most important piece of British armour of the entire war, and a bureaucracy that had already started writing the letter to kill it. The letter came from the Department of Tank Design. It was direct. Major Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel Witheridge were to cease all work on mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman tank. Immediately, no explanation was given, but the reason was not hard to find. The Department of Tank Design had a project of its own. The A-30 Challenger, the same tank Witheridge had just evaluated at Lulworth and found wanting. It was behind schedule, over budget. Failing trials. And the last thing the department wanted was 2 officers at a gunnery school in Dorset, proving that a better answer already existed in a shed. Because if Brighty and Witheridge succeeded, the Challenger became something worse than late. It became unnecessary. This is the moment where most stories end. A letter from above. A project killed in a single paragraph. 2 men reassigned to something harmless. And 18 months later, British tank crews land in Normandy carrying 75mm guns that cannot touch a Panther from the front at any range that matters. That is the version of history that almost happened. But George Witheridge had been inside a burning Grant at Gazala. He had heard the sound of shells bouncing off German steel, and he was not a man who obeyed orders when he believed the orders were wrong. He picked up the telephone, because behind that letter, unseen in Normandy but already moving, was Panzer Division, 86 Panthers operational. Every one of them mounting a gun that could kill a Sherman from a mile away, every one of them wrapped in armour that no British 75 could crack from the front at any range that mattered. The British Army was walking into a fight it could not win with the guns it had, and the only weapon in England capable of changing that arithmetic was sitting in a shed on the Dorset coast, locked to its mount, shaking itself apart with every shot. Officially, already dead. Officially, Witheridge knew the army. He had been inside it long enough to know that a letter from the Department of Tank Design was not the last word. It was only the first word. What came next depended entirely on who else you could get to pick up the phone. His first call went to a man who understood the desert. Major General Raymond Briggs had commanded the 1st Armoured Division in North Africa. Briggs had seen what British guns could and could not do at Gazala, at Alam Halfa, at El Alamein. Briggs was now director of the Royal Armoured Corps. When Witheridge told him what Brighty had built at Lulworth, the locked gun, the shaking chassis, the rounds that punched through Panther armour at 1,000 yards, Briggs did not need convincing. He had watched too many Grants burn, he knew what it meant. Through Briggs, the call reached higher still. His name was Claude Gibb. He was not a soldier, he was an industrialist, an engineer by training, and now the Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply. Gibb did not care about elegance. He did not care about departmental politics. He cared about one thing only: could it be built? Could it be manufactured? Could it be put into the hands of British crews before the invasion? Witheridge and Brighty explained what they had done. The gun, the turret, the recoil, the crude and shaking prototype in the shed at Lulworth. Gibb listened. Then he asked one question that broke the entire argument open. Was it possible? Because Gibb had just been told something. A senior British officer had recently returned from Australia, and in his Australia, on the other side of the world, the 17-pounder had already been mounted successfully on the Australian Sentinel tank. It was not theory, it was not sketches on paper, it had been done. Somebody else had done it first, in a country most Englishmen could not find on a map. That single fact changed everything. If the Australians could put a 17-pounder in a tank, then the Department of Tank Design could not credibly say it was impossible. And if it was not impossible, then a letter telling 2 officers to stop was not policy. It was cowardice. Gibb overruled the department. The Sherman 17-pounder became an official Ministry of Supply project, and here is where the story turns a knife inside itself. Because the moment the project was approved, it was taken away from the men who had fought for it. Brighty and Witheridge, the officer who had built it, and the officer who had refused to let it die, were not put in charge of what came next. The official history would later describe them, in a phrase that says everything, as highly enthusiastic and devoted amateurs. Amateurs. The men who had risked their careers, ignored a direct order, and dragged the weapon that would save British tank crews into existence, were now being told to step aside so that the professionals could take over. The professional had a name, W.G.K. Kilbourn, a civilian engineer from Vickers, assigned to the Department of Tank Design at Chertsey. He had never been inside a burning tank. He had never heard the sound of shells bouncing off Panzer armour. He did not carry Gazala in his head. What he had was something Brighty and Witheridge did not. He had the discipline to turn a Frankenstein into a weapon that could be built by the hundreds, in real factories, on a real deadline, with the invasion of France, now less than a year away. And he faced the same wall they had faced. 40 inches of recoil, 18 inches of space, a gun that was physically too large for the turret it had to live in. Every obvious answer had already failed. You could not shorten the barrel. That would kill the muzzle velocity that made the 17-pounder lethal in the first place. You could not enlarge the turret. There was no time to design a new one, and no factory tooled to build it. You could not remove the recoil, the way Brighty had. That was tearing the tank apart with every shot. Kilbourn looked at the problem from a direction no one else had tried. He did not ask how to fit the gun into the turret. He asked how to redesign the gun so that the turret would not know the difference. The 17-pounder, in its normal form, loaded from the top. The breech swung upward. The loader dropped a shell into the chamber. The breech swung down, simple, fast, and impossible inside a Sherman turret, because the breech would strike the roof before it opened wide enough to take a round. Kilbourn rotated the entire breech mechanism 90 degrees. Instead of opening upward, it now opened sideways. To the left, the loader would push the shell in from the side. It was awkward, it was slower, it was ugly, it worked, because the turret was wider than it was tall. By using the width instead of the height, Kilbourn had stolen the inches he needed. That was only the beginning. The recoil cylinders on a standard 17-pounder sat behind the gun in a straight line, absorbing 40 inches of backward travel. There was no room for 40 inches behind the gun in a Sherman turret. So Kilbourn threw out the original cylinders entirely. He designed new ones, shorter, fatter, and he mounted them not behind the gun, but on either side of it. 2 cylinders, one high, one low, cradling the barrel between them, each absorbing half the recoil, neither needing 40 inches. Together, they stopped the gun in a space the turret could handle. Think about what that means. The problem every engineer had called unsolvable. The gun is too big for the turret. Kilbourn solved not by changing the turret, but by changing how the gun lived inside it. Then came the smaller problems, and there were dozens. The bigger breach meant the loader could no longer escape through the commander's hatch in an emergency. So Kilbourn cut a new hatch into the turret roof. The radio that normally sat at the back of the turret had nowhere to live. So he welded an armoured box onto the outside of the turret. The crews would come to call it the bustle. He punched a hole through the casting to reach it. The hull gunner's position up front was eliminated entirely. His seat, his machine gun port, his periscope, all removed. The space filled with racks for the 17-pounders ammunition, which was longer and heavier than the old 75mm rounds. Every one of these changes was visible. Every one of them was ugly. Every one of them made the tank look wrong. And on November the 11th, 1943, Kilbourn had a working prototype. The Frankenstein had become a real tank. Now, something remarkable happened. Before the prototype had even completed final testing, before the War Office had signed off on performance, before anyone had fired the weapon in anything resembling combat conditions, an order was placed. 2,100 units, 2,100 tanks, ordered before the design was proven. Hold that number for a moment. 2,100. That was not confidence. That was desperation. The men signing that order knew what was waiting in France. They knew about the Panthers. They knew that without this weapon, British armour would land on the beaches of Normandy, unable to fight the enemy's heaviest tanks head-on. And they knew the A-30 Challenger, the tank the Department of Tank Design had been protecting, was not going to be ready in time. Production began in January of 1944. The factories worked from existing Sherman hulls, mostly the American M4A4, which the British called the Sherman 5. Each conversion took weeks of skilled labour. The turret had to be partially rebuilt. The breech had to be factory-fitted with Kilbourn's rotated mechanism and his side-mounted recoil cylinders. The bustle had to be welded on, the hatch cut, the hull gunner's position stripped out and filled with racks. Every single Firefly, the crews were calling it that by March, probably because of the violent muzzle flash when the 17-pounder fired, was a handmade modification of a mass-produced American tank. By May the 31st, 1944, 6 days before the invasion, 342 Fireflies had been delivered to 21st Army Group. 342, for an entire army group about to invade a continent defended by Panthers and Tigers, and the best-equipped armoured divisions Germany had ever fielded. Was enough for exactly one Firefly per troop of 4 tanks, 3 ordinary Shermans whose 75mm guns could not kill a Panther from the front, and 1 Frankenstein that could. The men who would crew those Fireflies had no idea that they were about to become the most hunted tanks in Normandy. June the 6th, 1944, 7:20 in the morning, the tanks of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards rolled off their landing craft onto Gold Beach, first armoured unit to touch Normandy. Among them was Sergeant Wilfrid Harris. Harris was 33 years old, from Walsall in the West Midlands. He had joined the 4th 7th before the war, left the army in 1935, and come back the day it started. He had been at Dunkirk in 1940. He had watched his regiment abandon every vehicle it owned on the beach and sail home with nothing. 4 years later, he was back, this time commanding a Sherman that looked different from every other tank in his troop. He was one of 342, 1 tank per troop, the only one in his troop that could kill what was waiting inland. Within 48 hours, every British tanker in Normandy understood the problem. The Panthers were not rare. Intelligence had predicted scattered appearances. A few here, a few there. What Panzer had actually brought into Normandy was 86 operational Panthers, 3 more in the workshops, and every one of them was in the hedgerows south of Bayeux. The 12th SS Hitler Youth Division had another 66. Between them, 2 divisions alone had put more than 150 Panthers into the hedgerows south of Bayeux. They were everywhere. Every engagement followed the same sickening pattern. The British 75s opened fire. The shells bounced. The Panther's gun answered once. A Sherman burned. But something else was happening, something the Germans had not expected. June the 9th, 3 days after the landings. 12 Panthers from the 12th SS attacked the village of Norrey-en-Bessin. A Canadian Firefly of the 1st Hussars, commanded by Lieutenant G. K. Henry, was waiting. His gunner, Trooper A. Chapman, watched the Panthers advance in column until they lined up, as he would later put it, like ducks in a row. He fired 6 rounds. 5 Panthers were destroyed in under 2 minutes. The attack collapsed. That engagement travelled fast. Up the German chain of command into every panzer regiment and anti-tank position in Normandy, the message went out. Not every Sherman was the same. One of them hit harder. One of them punched through frontal armour at ranges where the 75 was useless. And that one had a barrel you could identify from 1,000 yards, longer, thinner, unmistakable against a hedgerow. The order was direct. Find the long-barreled Sherman, kill it first, before it fires. Overnight, the Firefly became the most important tank in every British troop, and the most hunted. The crews learned fast. Some painted the forward half of the barrel white, a trick called countershading, trying to make it look shorter at distance. Others fitted false muzzle brakes halfway along the barrel to disguise where it really ended. A few bolted dummy 75mm guns to the turret bustle and reversed the turret entirely, so that the fake gun pointed forward at the enemy and the real one pointed back over the engine deck. None of it changed the arithmetic. 1 Firefly per 4 tanks. Lose it, and the other 3 had nothing. By June the 23rd, still just over 2 weeks in, 22 Fireflies had been knocked out across Normandy. Only 6 replacements had arrived. That was the trajectory the crews were living on. Remember the number from earlier. 342 delivered before the invasion. And already, the losses were climbing faster than the factories could replace them. For a weapon, nobody could afford to lose. For crews being systematically hunted by every German gunner in France. But that trajectory was still ahead of Sergeant Harris on the 13th of June, when the 50th Northumbrian Division received orders to push south of Bayeux and take a cluster of villages sitting astride the road to Tilly-sur-Seulles. One of them was called Lingèvres. The division would attack with the Durham light infantry on foot, supported by the tanks of the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards. Harris's Firefly was assigned to 4th Troop, a squadron. At full strength, the troop had 4 tanks. By the morning of June the 14th, it had 3. One was already gone. Lieutenant Alastair Morrison commanded. Corporal Johnson had a standard Sherman, and Harris had the only gun in the troop that could answer what Panzer was about to send down the road. The Durhams stepped off at 10:15 in the morning. The attack was preceded by everything the British could throw. Divisional artillery laid a creeping barrage across the fields south of Bayeux. Rocket-firing Typhoons came in low over the tree lines. And at 10:15, the men of the 6th and 9th Battalions of the Durham Light Infantry rose from their positions and walked forward through the wheat. The Germans of Panzer were waiting. This was not a conscript division holding a quiet sector. Panzer had been built from the instructors of every tank school in the Reich. Every soldier had been selected. Every crew had trained others before being sent to fight. They were, by any measure, some of the finest troops Germany could still field in the summer of 1944. And they had been in this ground since June the 8th, digging in around Tilly-sur-Seulles, camouflaging positions in the hedgerows, sighting machine guns down every lane. They let the Durhams come close, very close, 150 yards, the length of a football pitch and a half, close enough to see faces. Then they opened fire. What followed was 5 hours of fighting at a range where war becomes personal. Hedgerows turned every lane into an ambush. German machine guns covered every approach. Snipers worked the upper windows of stone farmhouses. The Durhams fought field by field, house by house, with bayonets and grenades and the kind of grinding, close-quarters violence that fills casualty reports with numbers that cannot convey what happened to the men behind them. By early afternoon, Lingèvres was taken. The cost, for the 9th Battalion alone, was 22 officers and 226 other ranks killed or wounded. 248 men. Nearly half the battalion, gone in a single day. A 6th DLI officer would later call the attack the best one the battalion launched during the entire Normandy campaign. That gives you some idea of what the worst ones looked like. Major John Mogg, acting battalion commander of the 9th DLI, reached the village centre and set up a casualty station in the church. The Panzer infantry pulled back. The tanks came forward. 4th Troop, a squadron, 4th 7th Dragoon Guards, rolled into Lingèvres to hold what the infantry had paid for in blood. 3 tanks, Morrison, Johnson, Harris, 1 Firefly, Lieutenant Morrison parked his Sherman near the church, centre of the village, covering the crossroads. Corporal Johnson positioned his to the south, watching the road from below. Harris drove his Firefly to the eastern end of the main road, the road that ran straight toward Tilly-sur-Seulles, straight toward the German lines, and stopped. He was facing east. Behind him, the village. Around him, the Durhams organising what defence they had left, dragging wounded into the church, setting up the 2 6-pounder anti-tank guns that had survived the advance. Ahead of him, 800 yards of open road lined with hedgerows, running into territory Panzer Lair still controlled. Harris opened his cupola hatch and stood in the commander's position, binoculars up, scanning east. Beside him in the turret sat his gunner, Trooper Ian McKillop. The two had worked together long enough to need no speeches. Harris spotted. McKillop fired. That was the partnership. Whether it would work against what was coming depended on something neither of them controlled. Whether the enemy came from the front, where the 17-pounder could reach, or from a direction where even the Firefly was just another thin-skinned Sherman with nowhere to hide. For a few minutes, the road east was empty. Then Harris saw movement. On the road from Tilly, shapes in the afternoon haze. Low, angular, moving. He adjusted his binoculars. The silhouette was unmistakable to any man who had been briefed on German armour in the weeks before the invasion. The long gun, the sloped glacis, the wide tracks, 2 Panthers, from the 6th and 7th Companies of Panzer Regiment 130. 10 Panthers had been committed to the counterattack. These were the first 2, 400 yards, closing, and Sergeant Harris, sitting in the one tank within a mile that had any chance of stopping them, had perhaps 10 seconds to decide. Fire first, and give away his position or hold, and risk letting 45 tons of German steel fire first. He did not wait. Harris gave the order. McKillop laid the crosshairs on the lead Panther, 400 yards, coming straight down the road. He fired. The 17-pounder round left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At that range, the flight time was under a heartbeat. The shell struck the Panther head-on. The tank stopped. Smoke began to pour from the hatches. No one appeared. 1 round, 1 Panther, dead on the road to Tilly-sur-Seulles. Harris did not pause. The second Panther was right behind the first, already slowing. Its crew had seen the lead tank shudder and halt, but they had not yet understood what killed it. They had seconds to react. They did not get them. McKillop fired again. The second round struck the second Panther. The tank lurched, veered off the road, and stopped. It was disabled, immobile, but not, in that first moment, destroyed. The crew realized what had happened faster than their tank could tell them. They threw the hatches open, scrambled out, ran for the hedgerow. They did not make it. Waiting for them, working forward through the ditches and the wheat, was an infantry tank hunting party. It was led by Major John Mogg, acting battalion commander of the 9th DLI, the same officer who had set up his casualty station in the church less than an hour before. His men caught the Panther crew as they ran, and then they finished the tank, a P-80 rocket, fired at close range into the side of the wounded Panther. The second tank burned where it stood. This is the part of the story the legend leaves out. 2 Panthers destroyed at the east end of Lingèvres. But not 2 by the Firefly alone, 1 by McKillop's gun, 1 by Harris's gun disabling it, and Major Mogg's infantry finishing it with a shoulder-fired rocket in the hedgerow. That is not a smaller story. It is the true story. British tanks and British infantry, killing German armour together. In a village, they had all bled for that morning. Now Harris did something that separates a competent tank commander from an exceptional one. He did not stay in position. 2 burning Panthers on the East Road told every German observer within a mile exactly, where a 17-pounder had just fired. Their gunners were already looking for him, so Harris reversed out of the eastern position, drove back through the village, and repositioned to the northwest side, near a farmhouse, screened by a row of oak trees. From there, he had a clear line of sight down the western approach, the road coming in from Longray. This was not the move of a cowboy. This was the move of a man who understood what 1 Firefly was worth, and what happened to Firefly crews who let themselves be found twice. He had been in the new position for perhaps 20 minutes when he saw them. 3 more Panthers, from the west this time, moving in column along the road toward the village, and they had not seen him. They did not know that the gun, which had just killed 2 of their cruds on the opposite side of Lingèvres, was now sitting behind a row of oaks on their flank. Harris watched them come. He waited, until the geometry was right, until Panthers were passing across his field of fire, rather than driving toward him. A flank shot. The Panther's side armor was 40 millimeters, less than a third of the frontal plate. At this angle, at this range, McKillop could go through it like paper. Harris gave the word. McKillop fired. The first round struck the lead Panther in the engine compartment. The tank burned instantly. He fired again. The rearmost Panther in the column took a round through the back. It stopped just inside the village. He fired a third time. The middle Panther, caught between the two burning wrecks, took a round in the running gear. It lost steering, rolled another 100 yards, broke down near the church. The crew abandoned it there. 3 rounds, 3 Panthers. In the space of a minute, add it up. 5 shells fired at Panthers from Harris's Firefly across the whole afternoon. 4 Panthers destroyed by the 17-pounder outright. 1 Panther, bit disabled by the 17-pounder, finished by Major Moggs Piatti. 5 Panthers stopped, all 5, by Harris and his gunner and the infantry working with them. Let that settle for a moment. A tank that Britain's own Ministry of Supply had tried to kill in its cradle. A weapon built by 2 officers who were ordered to stop. Engineered by a Vickers civilian who turned the gun sideways to make it fit. Rushed into production before the prototype was fully proven. Had just done, in one afternoon at one village, what no other Allied tank in Normandy could do at all. The fighting around Lingèvres continued through the afternoon. It was not a one-tank battle. It was a village-sized brawl. Corporal Johnson's Sherman, holding the crossroads near the church, took a hit from a German armoured car and was knocked out. His crew got out, wounded, alive. Captain John Sterling arrived with the 2nd Troop of Fireflies and put 3 armour-piercing rounds into a Tiger tank that had come up in support of the Panzer Lehr counterattack. The Tiger burned. A squadron of the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards lost 4 Shermans in Lingèvres that day. One of them was a Firefly. It was not Harris's Firefly. Someone else's crew, in a machine that looked exactly like his, died in a village where his had lived. The 6th and 7th Companies of Panzer Regiment 130 had committed 10 Panthers to the counterattack on Lingèvres. They lost 9 of them. The 2nd Battalion of the 902nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, the infantry, that had held the village that morning and fought to retake it that afternoon, lost 257 men killed, wounded, and missing. Nearly the same number as the 9th DLI had lost taking the village at dawn. There is no clean version of Lingèvres. There is no side that walked away whole. On the road east of the village, 2 Panthers cooled in the sun. On the road west, 3 more. In the church, Major Moggs' casualty station worked through the afternoon on Durham wounded. On both ends of the same village, on the same day, 2 elite forces had ground each other down in numbers that come close to matching. That is what actually happened. By nightfall, the Durham Light Infantry and the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards held Lingèvres. 9 German tanks lay burning in and around the village. The story that travelled farthest from that place, though, was not the infantry sacrifice. It was not the total tank count. It was 5 rounds fired by 1 Firefly, and the fact that every one of those rounds mattered. Within days, the report reached 21st Army Group Headquarters. Within weeks, the War Office in London, and within months, the desks of the 2 men who had started all of this in a shed at Lulworth with a locked gun, a shaking chassis, and an order to stop. The men who had been dismissed as amateurs. After Lingèvres, the numbers moved fast. By late June, 149 Fireflies were in Normandy. By the end of July, 235. By autumn, the allocation had doubled, 2 Fireflies per troop instead of 1. By the time the factories stopped in 1945, more than 2,000 had been built, every one of them carrying Kilbourn's sideways breech. His shortened side-mounted recoil cylinders, his welded bustle at the back of the turret. Every one of them descended from a prototype that had shaken itself half apart in a shed on the Dorset coast. The Germans never stopped hunting them. For the rest of the campaign, the order held. Kill the long-barreled Sherman first. Firefly crews learned to live as marked men. They painted their barrels. They hid behind hedgerows. They knew that the muzzle flash of the 17-pounder, bright enough to blind their own gunner for an instant, told every German within a mile where they were. They fired anyway, and something unexpected showed up in the loss reports. Despite being the priority target on every battlefield they entered, 19% of Fireflies were knocked out in Normandy. The rate for standard Shermans was 29%. The most hunted tank in every British troop was surviving better than the tanks the Germans were supposed to ignore. When you can kill the thing that is trying to kill you, the arithmetic changes. The 4th 7th Dragoon Guards fought on through France. They became the first British armoured unit to cross the Seine. They led part of the column driving toward Arnhem during Market Garden. They pushed through northern Germany and finished the war at Bremerhaven on the North Sea coast, a long way from Gold Beach. Sergeant Wilfred Harris survived. He had survived the interwar army, survived Dunkirk, survived the hedgerows, survived commanding the most targeted tank in every troop he served in. The man from Walsall, who had first worn the badge of the 4th 7th in peacetime, wore it through 2 evacuations and 1 whole war. Trooper Ian McKillop, the gunner whose hands had put 5 rounds on 5 targets in one afternoon at Lingèvres, survived beside him. Of Brighty and Witheridge, the records say less. The official history called them highly enthusiastic and devoted amateurs. They were not invited to take credit when the Firefly proved itself. Their names do not appear on the production documents. Kilbourn is remembered as the designer, the 2 officers who forced the project into existence, who ignored an order, who spent months proving in a shed that a 17-pounder could live inside a Sherman turret, are a footnote in most histories of British armour. But the idea belonged to them. The stubborn, unreasonable insistence that the next campaign would not be fought with the same guns that had failed in the last one. That belonged to them. It is important not to make this into one man's story. The Firefly at Lingèvres was Harris and McKillop, but the Panthers on the East Road were killed by McKillop and Major Mogg's PI-8 team together. The village was taken by Durham riflemen at a cost that would gut a battalion. The Tiger was killed by Stirling. The wounded were carried into a church that a battalion commander turned into an aid station between running one fight and starting another. The gun in the turret existed because a burned officer refused to be quiet, and an Australian engineer put a 17-pounder in a Sentinel first, and a civilian at Vickers turned a breech sideways in an office at Chertsey. Every part of this story needed every other part. If you go to Lingèvres today, the village is quiet. Stone houses line the same roads. There is a memorial to the Durham Light Infantry, listing the 248 men of the 9th Battalion, lost on the 14th of June, 1944. There is a memorial to the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards on the road north of town. For years after the war, 2 of the Panthers that McKillop's gun had killed sat rusting at the western entrance of the village. Blackened, silent, left where they had burned. Go back to where this started, a village called Lingèvres. A sergeant in a tank that looked wrong, barrel too long, breech opening sideways, a steel box bolted where it did not belong, a tank the system had never wanted. That existed only because 2 men disobeyed an order. One engineer reimagined the impossible, one industrialist overruled a department, and a country gambled on a weapon it had not finished testing. 5 shots, 5 Panthers, 4 killed by the gun, 1 finished by infantry, 9 German tanks in and around the village by nightfall. 248 Durham men gone, taking the ground it stood on. 257 Panzer Grenadiers gone trying to take it back. There is no clean legend here. There is only what the men on both sides paid for one afternoon, at one crossroads, in one village nobody outside Normandy had ever heard of. They called it a Frankenstein. On June the 14th, 1944, the monster answered, "Thank you for staying with me all the way through." If this story meant something to you, hit like. It genuinely helps the algorithm push these older, quieter stories in front of the people who care about them. And if you have not subscribed yet, now would be a good time. The next one is coming. I would like to know where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, an uncle, a grandfather, someone who never talked about it much when he came home, tell me about him in the comments. Their stories deserve to be heard, and there are more of us here who want to listen than you might think. I will see you in the next one.